Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot allow Lord Poe to get away with two pieces of misinformation. Number one, there are about 70 million communists, and if you think, like the Henry Kissinger approach of not calling China a communist state, all you have to do is to take your flight tomorrow to Beijing, which leaves at 12 o'clock, and go to Tiananmen Square, and even whisper under your breath that you are a member or that you don't mind Falun Gong, and you will see where you will be, because you won't be seen for another few months or possibly years. And I don't understand at all how that does not manifest itself a communist regime. And secondly, in support, can I just finish my second point, Lord Power, against my friend, if you were one of the individual, and I will come to this very important point in the second part of my speech, if you were one of the million people who went protesting, you would be less supercilious about the way in which you brush aside their protest and their discontentment. It is a very serious matter for individuals to have their right and gain what they want. And the fact that you produce some numbers which amount to 0.11% as a way of saying that that was a healthy sign of the country is, I think, a travesty to the livelihood of people in China. But yes, Lord Powell.
I think he is actually misrepresenting me. China is an authoritarian state, as I said, and it's not something we particularly like the look of, though it is a successful model. Communists they are not. There is no communist ideology left alive in China today. I agree it's called the Chinese Communist Party. Its real name, ladies and gentlemen, is the Chinese Ruling Party. It exists only for one thing, which is to rule China. It may not be attractive in our system, it has delivered remarkably. And I didn't sneer at demonstrations. I said they were a very welcome feature of modern China, and actually speaks quite well of the regime that they are allowed to take place on the scale they do.
Well, let me say in this debate, we on our side of the House do not deny the extraordinary achievements of China in the past decades, or even doubt the upward spiral of its growth. But the motion implies something different. It implies that China will become, in this century, like the United States, a superpower, or even a superpower more powerful than the United States. It is this implication that my friends and I will argue against. We argue against it because of several fundamental issues which are either very difficult to change or even at a loss for change. I just mentioned some very basic elemental things like land, air and water. As China is going from a rural agricultural society to an urban and industrial one, there are increasing problems of protecting arable land. There is only 900 square meters of arable land per inhabitant, which is less than 40% of the global average. Even more alarming is that these limited resources are constantly diminishing. For example, wholesale rural areas are being forced by governments to be turned into urban cities in the name of progress, as you have mentioned, Lord Powell, as if that was actually real progress. Then there is air, rather air pollution, I would say. I don't think anybody in this chamber would doubt for a moment that the air in China is not very good, particularly in the city. It got so bad that last summer the Chinese authorities actually asked foreign consulates to stop publishing inaccuracies and unlawful data on air pollution, which of course was a direct reference to the quality measurements that the US Embassy in Beijing publishes on Twitter, which registered descriptions such as crazy bad or beyond index. There is also serious air pollution from metal smelters and a fast-growing battery industry. This gives rise to very serious lead poisoning, one of the most common pediatric health problems, with 1/3 of China's children suffering from elevated blood lead levels. There's water. The over-extraction of groundwater and falling water tables are huge problems in China. Water is going to be very precious and scarce. The exploitation of dams and other irrigation infrastructure have almost halted the Yellow River natural course, threatening to dry up the entire river valley. In 1997, the Yellow River did not flow 230 days of the year. Therefore, just looking at these simple, essential conditions of life, land, air, and water, China faces enormous problems, aggravated by a vast population of 1.3 billion, and further aggravated by the demographics, as my friend has mentioned, which have created what someone has called a perfect storm. Now, let me explain. First, China's total working age population is set to fall continually in the next 20 years, as mentioned before. In fact, by 2030, there would be more than 4 older workers for every 3 younger ones. Now, with this smaller and much greyer Chinese workforce, the growth rates of the recent past in the economy simply not going to be sustainable. Secondly, China will experience a population explosion of senior citizens in the next 20 years. By 2030, there will be 240 million of them at over the age of 65 or older. I'll soon be one of those people. All my friends who've come up from London are in fact older than that already. But China is going to have 240 million of them. This swelling class of senior citizens will undoubtedly place enormous economic pressures on China that no country of a comparable income level has ever had to face. Third, because of the one-child policy, which tend to favor boys, with appalling statistics on the infanticide of girls, China will have a great imbalance between male and female. In 2005 already, there were 120 boys for every 100 girls. The result is going to be a growing population of unmarried and, may I say, frustrated young men. And that is something which I wouldn't want to be one of. And fourth, the one-child policy has also meant that for this generation there is no brother, no sister, no niece, no nephew, no uncle, no aunt. Given the traditional Chinese family structure relying heavily upon blood relatives in business, her economic performance is bound to be affected. But perhaps the most critical question on China's advancement rests with the leadership, these members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, whose photograph we have seen across the world. So little is known about how these chosen few work together, or even what they think, or how they come to their conclusions. I love to be a fly on the wall more than anything else. In all the major decisions of state, there's a blanket of opacity which has not changed since the founding of the Communist Party in 1949. This has created an enormous amount of mistrust, and not surprisingly, there are continual protests all over the countries, which has been mentioned by my friend, on abuses of power involving bribery and corruption and social injustices. There seems to be a total disconnect between government and people. My 2 friends will no doubt touch upon this most important issue, because this dysfunctionality can never be the basis of a great nation. And if you want to lead in any century, you have to be a great nation. But what I would like most to highlight tonight is the plight of the individual in China. Far too often we have conferences, seminars, Lord Powell, Lord Wei, Lord this, Lord that, talking about China as a country, what sort of progress it has achieved, numbers on economic growth, rising GDP, diminution of poverty, rise of middle class, etc. Yet seldom do we focus on the individual. It's all very well to talk about the progress of the damming of the 3 gorges. How about the 1 million people who have been displaced? It's all very well to talk about the great Olympic Games with the diversion of water into Beijing for the enjoyment of visitors and for the world to see. But how about the places from which the water had to come namely Hebei and Shanxi provinces, which were already devastated by drought and severe shortages. It is all very well to herald a new leadership in the present 18th Congress, but how about the surveillance of over 1 million people patrolling the streets of Beijing, and many systematically rounded up and detained or put under house arrest for the duration of the Congress? Taxi drivers apparently have been asked to take away the window handle so that people can't throw leaflets out. When I used to live in China in the early 80s, I was very conscious of almost a soft reign of terror that prevails over the capital. It was an acute sense of fear for the authorities. 30 years later, of course there have been less nervousness, but I still can detect that sense of fear, or at least helplessness. When people are asked what they think about the 18th Congress, they say they're not interested. I think what they really mean is that there is nothing they could do, and therefore there is no reason why they should be interested. Whatever you say against democracy, it is a system that allows the individual to feel that something can be done, and that the citizen is able to participate, even in some small way, in the process of where the country is going. But in China, with an autocracy, there is only a sense of hopelessness. I cannot help feeling the prevalence of an enormous amount of personal discontentment. Even if commentators have pointed out that hundreds of million people have been lifted out of poverty, which is defined by $125 per day, there are still hundreds of millions living on $2 a day. Big deal. So it is important for us to put some perspective on a kind of propaganda that issues not from the authorities, but also many of the panda huggers around the world, which is a phrase I borrowed from Sir Christopher. If there is rosiness on the macro level, there is a great deal of unhappiness on the micro level. The 100,000 demonstrations we already talked about. It is precisely that sense of fear, almost like a ruthless headmaster in a borstal, that is for me the greatest hindrance to China emerging as a superpower in the world. Is that individual, not the country, not the progress, not the figures, the individual. There has got to be genuine meritocracy in the ruling authority as a real connection between government and people. I, for one, would love to see China emerging as a superpower in the 21st century. Remember, it was exactly 100 years ago this year that democracy was introduced in China. But I think it will take another 100 years for it to become a superpower, which is more or less what America took. So I think if we want any century to belong to China, I hope it will be, but it won't be the 21st, it will be the 22nd. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.